It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my very special guest is Mary Grabar, and we're going to be discussing her recent book, Debunking Howard Zinn, Exposing the Fake History That Turned a Generation Against America. Mary, it is truly an honor. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here.
Now, this is the first time you and I are connecting, Mary, and I know that you are going to be brand new to the majority of my listeners. So let's kick off this conversation with a bit of what we might call the Mary Grabar origin story. For those of us meeting you for the first time today, what are a few things we need to know about you?
Well, I was born in a communist country. My parents came here when I was 2 years old. I was born in the former Yugoslavia, the part called Slovenia now. So I was pretty young. I was 2 years old, but I kind of grew up with that sense of, being a little different and coming from a background where the adults talked about being persecuted, being fearful, having sort of that shadow of communism over your life from day to day and being under the thumb of the communists. And as I, kind of went through and had a various number of jobs in advertising and even farming and vineyards in upstate New York. I then went back to school. I went to graduate school and earned my PhD eventually from the University of Georgia in 2002. And I wanted to, I just saw myself as living a pretty quiet life, teaching literature, the stories of Flannery O'Connor, the poetry of John Donne. But that was not to be, because in the 90s, as I discovered going back, academia was being more and more closed off to people who did not promote the party line and advance ideas of looking at literary works in terms of racism, sexism, and so forth. And I had a series of temporary jobs while I was living in Georgia. I had moved back to Atlanta from Athens, and I was writing about the corruption of education. So I thought, maybe there is something for me to tell people about what it's like to be someone who just really doesn't want to be political at all in the classroom, just focus on literature. And that, as a result, got me fired from a couple jobs. These were temporary adjunct positions. And as I was doing this, I had come across Howard Zinn, and that was around 2008. And he was like one of those bad guys to me, like Bill Ayers, really had no business being in education, was a subversive, hated this country. And I wrote about him, and I was invited to write a report and present it at a conference at the Press Club in Washington, D.C., and this was in 2010. And that was the year Howard Zinn died at the age of 87, I believe it was. And I presented that report at America's Survival. And after that, I got a call from an editor and an agent, and they wanted me to write the book on Howard Zinn. And I almost had a deal in 2011, but that fell through because the editor, after I had spent some months working on the proposal, realized that his publishing company was the one that published Howard Zinn's phenomenally successful A People's History of the United States. So that fell through, and I couldn't get anyone else interested in it at the time. So I kept teaching, and the last place I taught was at Emory University, and it was under a special program. But the funding for that ended. It was transferred over to something else, and so I was out of a job. And I had been coming up to Clinton, New York during the summer times on my way back from Rochester, where my family still lived, and met the director of the Alexander Hamilton Institute. And so when I was no longer teaching, I knew I had a place up here, and I became a resident fellow in 2014. And I've been here since. And in 2017, I did get the call from the editor that had originally been interested in my book. He was at another company. You may know all about how this works, being in the publishing industry. But that didn't work out. I got an agent, and I did end up with Regnery, and we had the contract, and I started writing the book in 2017, and it came out in 2019. And it has gone through 2 printings in hardcover, and it is now in paperback. So it is available.
I appreciate you taking the time to give us a little bit of your backstory. And I always love to hear the windy tale, if you will, of every book project. You know, to the outsider, they're just like, oh, wow, it's just magical. A book is on the shelf at the store and I go buy it. Yet each publishing journey, often it might be, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years or more in the making. And so it's always fascinating, especially as somebody who works in the publishing industry, to see what it took for a book to actually come to life. And one of the things you pointed out is like kind of an editor falling in love with an author's topic or a concept. That is true. We discover things like, oh man, I really want to work with that person. I actually recently transitioned, it was about a year ago, to a different publisher. And there were people I'd been trying to work with at my previous publisher for several years. And now I'm finally getting to work with them at the new publisher. So, if we can't get them at one place, we'll try to get people to work with us at the next. Anyways, fun to get to know you. Next, I would love to have you comment on the number of growing, I guess you might say the growing number of elected voices in U.S. government today who are running on socialist platforms, declaring themselves to be democratic socialists. I feel like we saw inklings of this, maybe some in the 2016 election, but as I look further and further back, I just have no recent recollection of this even being a thing. Yet it seems to be almost like the norm today. I would love to have you comment on how much we can thank Howard Zinn for his influence on some of these quote unquote rising stars within our government.
Every time Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez opens her mouth, I'm thinking she's going to start quoting Howard Zinn or referring to him as her hero. So many of the things that she says are concepts, ideas that can be found in his book. Last year, talking about, seems like a lifetime ago when, the news cycle, the liberal news cycle was about the concentration camps at the border. That's sort of a concept that Howard Zinn put forth, in his discussion of World War II, the internment of the Japanese, and these were really concentration camps, and we weren't any better than the Nazis. Her sort of knee-jerk reactions recently to who was the priest who went to Hawaii and was working with the lepers and got leprosy himself and died in his 40s, and she's referring to him as being part of the white patriarchy, and he shouldn't be honored at all. I mean, it's just this knee-jerk reaction to seeing someone with white skin being male, being ordained, and automatically these are the bad guys. That's the way Howard Zinn presents his history. European, white, Christian, you are bad. It's this Manichaean view of the world. The whites, Europeans who came to this pristine, sort of bucolic place where everyone lived in peace and harmony. Those are the bad guys. And that's sort of the lens the AOC sees the world through. And of course, she went to Boston University, where Howard Zinn taught until 1988. And the place still has an annual Howard Zinn lecture, a memorial lecture. And so his presence is still felt on that campus. And so I want to get firm evidence of that, but I see that in her. And it's the entire squad. They will just automatically rebel against anything that is traditional, that is pro-American, that is constitutional. And that is very much Howard Zinn. He hates this country. He wrote a book of communist disinformation, basically, which is being used as a textbook. So we see this, now more and more overtly. I mean, we can talk 10 years ago, would anyone have called herself a democratic socialist openly. They may have had those ideas and the goals of a democratic socialist, but would not be quite as open as they are today. And that just shows you the leftward shift that has taken place.
Somehow I avoided all of Zinn's work throughout my high school and college days, so maybe I'll just consider myself blessed. But, the first time I probably ever heard of Zinn was just sitting down and watching Good Will Hunting, which is such a ubiquitous movie. I think just about everybody has seen it at this point. I'd love to have you comment next about how Zinn's history, how his work became so popular. I'm just dumbfounded at the number of wealthy people and elite people, famous stars who've been all about promoting Zinn and his work while he was living and still after he's been gone for a while. There is a certain irony that you have wealthy and elite people promoting this work that really is trying to tell history from this bottom up and reshape history. It's definitely a strange company, if you will.
And I would like to say, he is famous for, writing this bottom-up history. He promoted that idea, and journalists often use that phrase and they accept it as a matter of fact. But one of the points I make in my book is that he is not really talking about average Americans, the workers, the people who worked in factories, as I remember growing up in Rochester, New York. He is talking about radicals, communists, members of the party who are sort of revered by what used to be called the parlor pinks. We still have them. They were around in the 1930s and they're still around. And they, for some reason, they are drawn to progressivism and radicalism. I think they have the leisure. They see themselves as saving the world. They are the ones that are going to be put in charge, redistributing the wealth and ordering, regular, ordinary people around and telling them how to conduct their lives. But that myth was promoted in Good Will Hunting. And I talk a little bit about that movie and how it came to be because I have a chapter on Howard Zinn's life, as sordid as it was. His personal life was quite sordid. Matt Damon grew up next door to Howard Zinn and his wife in Cambridge, and his mother was an education professor, and she was divorced, and Matt Damon and his brother would come over to the Zinn's house for cookies, as Howard Zinn says in his autobiography. And in 1980, when A People's History first came out, was published, Matt Damon was 10 years old. And of course, growing up in that milieu, having a mother who is a far-left education professor and hanging out with Howard Zinn, he was inclined to believe A People's History. And so what he did is he brought the book into his class for Columbus Day and started reading from it and telling, his classmates what the real story of Columbus was. So he was a friend, and when he wrote the screenplay, he included Howard Zinn's book. So, as you may recall, it's the story of this troubled 20-year-old genius who is a janitor at MIT, and it's all about class conflict and how our system promotes those who aren't really smart, but the true geniuses are consigned to a lifetime of work as janitors. So that's the story. So it's basically a story of class conflict and how someone rises above. But the character, Will Hunting, is ordered to have psychological counseling because he can't realize his potential. He refuses to, sort of act on his abilities, and he sees his psychiatrist, I think it's their first visit, and he sees on his bookshelf all these books, and there's a multi-volume work of American history. And he reads the title out loud, American History, Volume 1, and then he pauses and says, if you want to read a real history book, read Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. That book will knock you on your ass. So here, Howard Zinn has this key placement in this movie, and it's promoted, his book is promoted by a genius. And so what else could an author want, right? If you write a book, wouldn't you love to be the focus of a scene in an Oscar-winning movie that's seen by millions of people? And many people found out about A People's History of the United States through that movie. I've met people who had heard about it and went out and got the book. Some were impressed by it, others knew better. But that was sort of the genesis of the movie. So it's not like, some random screenwriter was so inspired by Howard Zinn's fantastic book that he decided to include it in a screenplay. It was actually Matt Damon, who was a friend of the family. And Matt Damon, to this day, continues to promote Howard Zinn.
And we've touched briefly about some of the ways that Zinn's ideas are influencing some of the fresh voices we've seen emerge in our government recently. I think next I'd love to have you comment about what are some of the ways Zinn's ideas, his teachings, are impacting current events. We talked about before we jumped into the interview that every day that we turn on the news, it almost seems like Zinn's vision to some degree has all of a sudden come to life.
Yes, well, he was an inspiration for the Occupy Wall Street movement. They had a library set up, and I wrote about that back then because I was writing about the Occupy Wall Street movement. And Antifa has kind of grown out of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And so there's that influence there. And you may recall that about a year ago, there was this man by the name of Van Spronson in Washington State who attempted to blow up an ICE detention facility and was shot by the police. He had a rifle with him, and so, they did it in self-defense, but he left behind a manifesto. He called the ICE detention facilities concentration camps and talked about the fascism ascendant in this country. And he said, read Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. So there are the marks of Howard Zinn on Antifa. So when you see references to background reading, if you're reading about Antifa, you'll see references to Howard Zinn. He's an influence on Black Lives Matter. There are these prizes given in Howard Zinn's name. I mean, there are literary festivals, there are prizes, there are all kinds of events connected to Howard Zinn and his memory and his history. And in 2015, the founders of Black Lives Matter were given the Howard Zinn Prize for Accomplishment or something. I forget the exact name of it. So all these radical groups are connected to Howard Zinn, and their inspiration comes from Howard Zinn's history.
We've touched briefly on how Zinn's ideas have influenced voices in government, how we're seeing that influence in current events. What about our modern education system? Is Zinn's influence solely happening at the college level, or has it also kind of rolled or flown downhill into kind of the K through 12 environment as well? Where has Zinn influenced modern education?
Everywhere. It's K through 12. It's in college. There is the Zinn Education Project, which distributes for free to teachers downloadable lessons adapted from his book. There are teacher guides to using his book, teacher guides from K through 12 and in college, so they know how to use his book in lessons. There are in-class activities that are put out there by the Zinn Education Project, a nonprofit which was started by one of Zinn's Boston University students. He became quite wealthy and used part of his money to set that up, ironically. to promote the ideas of his communist professor. In Portland, Oregon, I learned that all 8th grade students use a young people's history of the United States as their social studies book. So it's assigned. In high school, since the Obama administration changed the guidelines for the Advanced Placement U.S. History course, that's the course that advanced students take in order to get college credit, and if you pass that exam, you get the credit for it. They were revised, made much more specific, slanted to the far left, and it's been discovered, lo and behold, that Howard Zinn's book fits the bill very well. So if a student wants to ace the exam, and if you're a teacher and you have the pressure to produce students who do well on the exam, and if you use Howard Zinn's book, you will see that it fits the bill. It's good preparation for this exam that's slanted very far to the left. So it's being used openly now in these classrooms. Before, it used to be that teachers would sneak in photocopied pages. I'd learn about this as I attended these teachers' conferences and reported on them. But now it's used openly. I've seen extensive passages from Zinn's book used in other textbooks that are for middle school students. So they will have Howard Zinn's discussion of Ho Chi Minh in their book on Vietnam, and Zinn is described as a well-regarded historian. And of course, he presents the communist version of Ho Chi Minh. And so you see references pretty much all over. There are graphic adaptations, the graphic books. There are films. It's not just his, 700-some page book that's being used, but all the various adaptations that do come into the classroom. So although he has sold quite a number of books, about 3 million now, there is also added to that all these additional spin-off products that get into the classroom and that reach students and that give the Zinn version of American history.
Yeah, I was taking a few minutes when I was preparing for the interview to spend some time on NPD looking at Nielsen BookScan numbers for Howard Zinn's book and various ancillary and related products, and I was quite amazed at the wide range of material that were tied back to and grown out of that original book. And really, as I think really throughout 2020, as I work in the book industry, so I'm constantly monitoring bestseller lists, what's trending on Amazon and various things. And wow, in the last few months, you've definitely seen Howard Zinn pop up in a lot of places that I'd never personally seen him before. So certainly there has been an increased interest around this book, at least in the past few months.
I would add that Howard Zinn, I went through his papers at New York University, and he had a contract. He was so popular. I forget the name of the publisher, but you may have noticed there are all these spin-off books. Like now there's a people's history of the Civil War, there's a people's history of art history, a people's history of immigration, all these different subjects. And Howard Zinn really did nothing for them except, allow them to use his name and got a percentage of the royalties. So he was quite well-to-do because of the Zinn industry, and just lending his name got him all these royalties coming in.
And for the person listening who says, this is interesting and all, but I'm not sure that this really matters to me, why would you say it's important for really anybody, the average person, to learn about how Zinn's history is wrong? Why is it important that we understand this?
Oh, it's extremely important now. I almost feel like, a Cassandra who hasn't been listened to, because back in 2006, I started writing about the corruption of education, and we're seeing it now out on the streets. And I've spoken to a lot of groups, and one of the frustrations I have with Christian and conservative audiences is sometimes people tend to be insular. They'll say, well, yeah, they can teach that crazy stuff in the public schools, but my children are going to be homeschooled or they're going to a Christian school, which is, I think, the right thing to do. But we also cannot ignore what is going on in the public schools. And these students, and even in the private schools, Howard Zinn is popular, is widely used. So these are the people that are now out on the streets. They're out in the workforce. They're censoring people on Twitter, sort of pushing back conservative sites on Google. They're at the high-tech companies. They're taking over interstates. They're burning Bibles. They're knocking down statues. They are out there. We cannot avoid them. I was just thinking, I was out in Portland in January, and I spoke at Oregon State University, and it was mostly a hostile audience, but no one got out of hand. It was basically a civil discussion. Some people were convinced, some people weren't. But I felt perfectly safe in that city walking around. I wouldn't dare go to Portland now. But we're seeing this eruption, now that the opportunity has presented itself of these people who have been brainwashed by this communistic history of the United States. And deep in their hearts, they do believe that this is a fascist country and that they need to tear it down. Otherwise, we're going to have another Hitler, or they see Trump as being like Hitler, but it's because of crazy books they've read and lessons they've been given in school. And if you read Howard Zinn and you believe him, and if you're not skeptical, and there's no reason why you should be if you're a fifth or sixth grader, you believe it. And it's a very awful picture of the United States. And if it were true, there would be good reason to be anti-American. But what I do in my book is I go through his sources and look at where he distorts the evidence, he plagiarizes, he twists people's words around so they mean the opposite. So it is all false. As negative as it is also false. But you've got these people out in the streets, in mobs, who have been brought up to believe this stuff. And they're out there, and they're affecting us.
In terms of motivation, like from your perspective, what did Howard Zinn set out to do? Did he want to rewrite history, kind of, so to speak, in his own image of what he would have liked it to be? Was he trying to set the stage for what we're seeing happen on the world scene right now? What drove him to write the People's History of the United States?
Communism. He was a communist. He was a member of the Communist Party, although like all communists, he denied it. He was a member from about 1948 or 49 to about 53. He has an FBI file that's over 400 pages long. And Ron Radash, the historian who briefly was a member of the party himself before he came to his senses and became a conservative, analyzed Zinn's file. And he said, yes, this is true. He was a communist. So Howard Zinn, like the good communist he was, followed the orders. And in the 50s, the Communist Party members were told to go and infiltrate the institutions. And that's what Howard Zinn did. He went into the colleges and started spreading that communist propaganda. And his goal was to overturn this government. And every sort of situation that he presents in American history, he presents it as a case of hopelessness, that there is no hope of reform, that this nation was rooted in racism, will be eternally racist, it's sexist, it's unjust, it's founded on privilege, and none of this will change as long as we are operating under our current form of government. Our government makes it this way. And so what he's doing is he's carrying out the work of William Z. Foster, the Communist Party chairman, who wrote books of history and presented history in the same way. I mean, I kind of looked at Howard Zinn's book and Foster's book side by side and noticed, a remarkable number of parallels. They sort of follow the same narrative trajectory. So Howard Zinn wanted people to rise up. And that's the feeling you get when you finish reading his book. It's so frustrating. There's just this injustice, and people, the workers, the oppressed can never get ahead. The only solution, as he presents it, is to rise up and overthrow the government. And he valorizes violence. He presents riots as these romantic things, and it's glorious. Of course, he doesn't mention the deaths and destruction. And so what you're seeing today is what he really wanted to have happen. People have asked me, what would Howard Zinn think of what's going on today, 10 years after his death? He would be thrilled. This is what he wanted. This was his goal.
And for a book like Zinn's that really is a popular textbook, you would expect something like this to really meet a high academic standard, to have gone through the academic rigors, if you will. And one of the things I found really intriguing in your book is you talk about how, to put it nicely, he borrowed quite liberally from lots of other people's ideas, didn't document sources very well. Would love to have you comment on that a bit, because I think that's important to point out, is that for a work that is just supposed to be this fantastic piece of American history, it's actually, from a writing and academic perspective, it's not that great.
No, it's awful. I mean, as you said, from a writing and academic perspective, I would have failed him as a student for his plagiarism. The first 5.5 pages are basically lifted from his radical friend's book for high school students on Christopher Columbus. And that book, of course, itself is not a legitimate history book, because the author was not a historian. He was a novelist and a screenwriter. And Howard Zinn also does things you should never do. He uses ellipses to leave out critical information. So as I discovered when he is quoting from Columbus's journals, he has the ellipses, the 4 dots that indicate you've left out the end of a sentence or a sentence, but you're not changing the essential meaning. Well, he does. He leaves out pages of material with those ellipses, and what's in that material indicates the opposite of what he conveys by his quotation. He doesn't give you critical information, such as, who a pronoun they refers to, and so he pretends that Columbus, wants to enslave them, when really Columbus is talking about a hostile tribe and how they see these, gentle native Arawaks that Columbus encounters. He reads from U.S. government documents about, Vietnam, and he pretends that the reason we were in Vietnam was not to fight communism, but to gain resources and for imperialism. And then he quotes, but he leaves off the second part of the sentence, which is referring to the imperialism of the communists, and pretends that it's for the United States. Douglas Pike, he quotes his book. He was an American Foreign Service officer working in Vietnam from about 1960 to 66, and he wrote the book on the Viet Cong, and he analyzed the strategies that the Viet Cong used in the villages, and basically said that they were using agitprop. He accused the Viet Cong of genocide, and in his introductory remarks said we need to help the South Vietnamese, we need to fight the Viet Cong. Howard Zinn presents his book as promoting the Viet Cong, as claiming that they were teaching valuable communication skills to the villagers. The complete opposite. It is so deliberate and so obvious. But, your average high school student is not going to go look up the sources and see, what it is that Zinn is quoting. And as you said, it's hard to track down his sources. He doesn't use footnotes. His bibliography is pretty complete, but not, thorough. So you sort of have to track down these sources. And then once you do, you're shocked. I mean, how did someone get away with this for 40 years? A college freshman would not get away with it. A college freshman would have been kicked out of school. But Howard Zinn had made a bunch of money and was immensely successful, became a rock star of the historians, a celebrity, and his image and his words are still invoked to this day.
Mary, you cover a lot of ground in the book, but if you had to sum it up, what's that big idea you want every single reader to take away from the pages of Debunking Howard Zinn?
I want them to understand that Howard Zinn is not just a biased historian, nor is he doing anything in terms of uncovering the history of average Americans. As a matter of fact, his book is an insult to average, hardworking Americans. It is a book of communist disinformation. He is very tricky in the way he presents this history, the way he writes it. And my book is intended to be a tool, a factual tool with footnotes and documentation that reveals that his book is not just another left-wing book, nor is it a bottom-up history, but it is a book of disinformation. And for that reason, it should never be used in schools.
And Mary, for the listeners who would like to connect with you, find out more about the book, where can we connect with you online?
Oh, many places. I have a website called marygrabar.com. That's Grabar. dissidentprof.com. That's my nonprofit education reform initiative that I started, and I have a newsletter. I welcome people, invite them to sign up for my newsletter, and I just send out notices when I have articles published, or I'm making an appearance someplace. I am at the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization, where I'm a resident fellow, and that website is theahi.org, and I'm on Twitter at Mary Grabar and on Facebook. So there are many different ways to get in touch with me, but I do encourage people to sign up for my newsletter, and that way you can see what projects I'm working on, the articles I've published, and if I'm making any appearances.
And like we do with every episode, we'll have detailed links in the show notes, places where you can connect with Mary and pick up your own copy of the book as well. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Mary Grabar. Once again, our book today was Debunking Howard Zinn, Exposing the Fake History That Turned a Generation Against America. For more on Mary and the book, two great places to visit are number one, her website, which you can access at marygrabar.com, and also her other website, dissidentprof.com. And Mary, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure having you on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.